the moderator, Chen-Ling Hong. I'm from the Graduate Institute of Journalism. And of course, we are very happy to co-host this forum with the Excellency Journalism Award. And we are very happy that in this forum, we are able to invite the reporters and the media senior workers from different areas and countries in the Asia area. So we hope that everyone is very satisfied and is quite learning from this forum. And okay, as a moderator, my job is to introduce our speaker of this section, Ron Lopez. And Ron Lopez is from AFP. Yeah, as you know, it's AFP News Agency. His job is the Philippine correspondent for the global news. And he covered the disasters, politics, and geopolitical tensions between the Philippines, China, and the United States. Ron has reported on the front line about the Chinese aggression in the disputed South China Sea, which is called Western Philippine Sea from the Philippine perspective. Yeah, he talking to fishermen affected by the presence of the Chinese militia in the Scarborough Shoal and experienced firsthand the radio warnings from a Chinese Coast Guard ship while aboard a Philippine Coast Guard plane flying over the Spratly Island. The story you have read from our manual today, but of course, starting from this story, Ron will give us more inside perspective and he answered his experiences how to covering the international news, especially from Philippines perspective, and also as a reporter from an international news agency. So we are very happy to have Ron together with us. And also in this section, we have the discussant from local, Mr. Zhang Huaizhe. Zhang Huaizhe is now the senior researcher from the last generation. Sorry, it's my foundation, but I also forgot the name in English. 青平台，他是青平台的副研究员。And he's very knowledgeable about the politics and the history of Philippines, because if maybe someone has known that he has already published a book, it's a special topic about the Philippines. And the topic of this book is so knowledgeable, the origins of modern Philippine politics. So he will try to help us to understand, to understand the history and politics of modern Philippines, and from a Taiwanese perspective. So yeah, I expect that we will very, very interesting dialogue between Philippines and Taiwan. And also, of course, we will have a QA section about half an hour, which is open to, the table of the audience. So you are very, very welcome to raise your hands and raise questions, in the next section of the last part of this section. So just let us have a big applause to Ron for his speech today. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Hung, Professor Jeremy. Good afternoon. I know it's not the best part to present because people just ate, and so try not to sleep on its presentation. I'll try to keep this short. And thank you very much for the Foundation for Excellent Journalism for inviting me to be part of this forum. So I wanted to start this presentation by telling the story about our recent assignment to the South China Sea, or what Manila calls as the West Philippine Sea. which is the flashpoint of tension in the Asia Pacific. And just in April, a select group of journalists, including us from the AFP News Agency, was invited to go with a Philippine Coast Guard ship to document their operations in the Spratly Islands for 6 days. And in the first few days, it was just a regular patrol in the reefs and islands claimed by Manila. So they did resupply mission to the soldiers and visited the Coast Guard personnel stationed in those islands. But on our last 2 days, as we approached the waters near the territories claimed by China, we were awoken by radio challenges by a Chinese Navy warship. So I went outside the ship, it's in midnight, and saw this large shadow of a Corvette-class PLA Navy ship chasing us at a close distance and telling us to leave the area immediately. And on the following day, as you can see in my video here, there were two Chinese Coast Guard ships that's twice bigger than our vessel, shadowed us for several hours as we traversed the waters leading to Ayungin Shoal, or the second Thomas Shoal, which the Philippines claims, and where several Philippine Marines were stationed in a grounded Navy ship. And there, our ship, which is called the BRP Malabrigo, told the Chinese Coast Guard over the radio that we will conduct a site survey and ask the Chinese Coast Guard vessels to stay away or stay clear from the passage. But instead of heeding their request, this is what happened. One of the Chinese vessels cut off the other Philippine Coast Guard ship that was sailing with us, and that resulted in a near collision incident that, according to the ship captain, was the closest near collision incident that they encounter. So there, as journalists, we hid our fear, and we started filming what is happening before our eyes. So we filmed the harassment and intimidation by the much bigger ships from the Chinese Coast Guard. So we saw how they control the waters by deploying, a lot of their naval assets, which the Philippines don't have that much. And they also deployed boats, fishing boats, or at least what they called fishing boats. But the Philippine Coast Guard believed they are Chinese militia. And that story became headlines in the Philippines for several days. And it was a big story even for international media, because it was fully documented with actual videos and photos of the near collision incident. And there were testimonies from the ship's captain and from the crew of the ships that was threatened. And a month before that, I was on board a Philippine Coast Guard plane to join them in what they call a maritime domain awareness. It's a flight to observe and monitor the activities in the disputed waters from the sky. And there we also heard radio challenges, and we were told that we are entering the Chinese territory and that we should leave the area immediately. And the orders came from a Chinese Coast Guard ship that was loitering around the waters, which the Manila also claims as its own. And the incident was captured also by journalists present in the plane. But these incidents are not new. These actions by the Chinese Coast Guard are not new. In fact, the Philippine Coast Guard has documented several instances of harassment and close maneuvering by China's ships in the disputed waters, and their resupply mission have been blocked several times by the Chinese Coast Guards. So the Coast Guard plane has also been radio challenged almost every time it flies over the disputed territory. So the question is, what's new? Well, what's new is the Philippine Coast Guard's strategy to publicize all these unlawful activities by China. A Philippine Coast Guard official said that this new mandate came after an incident in February where a Chinese ship pointed what they said was a military-grade laser to a Coast Guard ship from the Philippines, and it temporarily blinded some of its crew. And the Philippines, of course, filed a diplomatic protest over it, and there was an uproar in the local political scene about what happened, but the incident was dismissed by Beijing. You know, its foreign minister claimed that it only used what they called a handheld laser to measure the distance between its ship and the Philippine vessels. And so this kind of what I call diplomatic gaslighting and the dismissal by China prompt the Philippine Coast Guard to step up to level up their efforts to protect their narrative from the Chinese propaganda that is going around. So what the Philippine Coast Guard did as a result was they started releasing more information and videos and photos of maritime incident involving China. So they even appointed a spokesman on matters concerning specifically on the South China Sea, who is both reachable for interviews and is also competent to speak on the matter. And a month later, they decided to bring us journalists to these crucial maritime patrols. Commodore J. Tariela, the Coast Guard spokesman for the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea, said this new move is part of their efforts to expose China's gray zone tactics in the South China Sea. Gray zone are activities that by definition are not necessarily illegal or escalating or promoting violence, but are not also peaceful. So the Philippines' aim with this new move is to put China on the spotlight to make it difficult for them to lie or to deny allegations. And they wanted to gather support not only from the public, but also from the neighboring countries in the Southeast Asia and in the West in hopes that they will come together and make China accountable for their actions. And it was successful. It was successful in getting the attention of the world. Leaders and ambassadors from different countries issued statements of concern about the near collision incident. Officials condemned China's action, and even President Marcos, the Philippine president, issued a statement about it. And what's more important is that China this time wasn't able to downplay the near collision incident because it was fully documented by journalists on the ground, although it put the blame on the Philippines, saying that the move was premeditated. So, but aside from this political repercussion of this new move, this is particularly important for us journalists as it gives us the opportunity to witness firsthand what's happening in this disputed waters thousands of miles away. These stories could have been almost impossible to document on our own, given the distance of these waters. For example, for our trip to the South China Sea, we traveled for over 1,000 miles just to get around the area. And of course, the resources needed and the dangers it poses to us for sailing onto the open sea. So this move gives us the chance, the journalists, to report based on what we saw on our lens, what we heard on our microphones, and what we felt during the moment, instead of relying on press releases or statements and repeating what government officials claim, which, to be honest, are not always the most accurate sources of information. So these hostile encounters of the Philippine Coast Guard with the Chinese Coast Guard is one of the main reasons why the relationship between the two Asian neighbors falters over the years, and why the Philippines decided to be best friend again with the US. So while former President Rodrigo Duterte walked away from its old treaty ally, the United States, and fostered close ties with Beijing in exchange for investment pledges, which, by the way, didn't fully materialize, his predecessor, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., did the total opposite. So while Duterte threatened to terminate the visiting forces agreement that is a key to the US military presence in the Philippines, and while he scaled down the joint military exercises with Washington, Marcos made it flourish under his term. So in a major policy shift that surprised even his critics, Marcos steered away from Duterte's pro-China policy and started his term with a strong statement saying the Philippines will not lose an inch of territory under his rule. And this was followed by a salvo of some of the biggest developments in the U.S.-Philippines relationship in recent years. Last year we saw several high-ranking officials from the United States paying courtesy to President Marcos after his landslide election win. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited in August. Vice President Kamala Harris also visited in November last year. So the visit of Vice President Kamala Harris was particularly symbolic as she visited the Palawan Island, which is the closest landmass, the closest island to the South China Sea. And there she met with the fishermen, and she gave a speech aboard a Philippine Coast Guard ship as a show of support to the Philippines' claim or Philippines' position in the South China Sea. And in February, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin went to the Philippines, and he met with President Marcos to seal the deal on expanding the U.S. access to Philippine military facilities. And with his meeting with Austin, Marcos said that the future of the Philippines will always have to involve U.S. due to its strong ties and deep history. So the two countries decided to accelerate the implementation of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA. It's an agreement that allows rotational deployment of U.S. troops and pre-position equipment in select facilities. And in the expanded deal, the Philippines allowed the U.S. to access 4 more additional sites aside from the 5 existing military sites. And among the new locations identified are 3 sites located in the northern Philippines, in the northern Luzon, near the Taiwan Strait, which observers believe are strategic in case China decides to invade Taiwan. And there are a lot more developments to the U.S.-Philippines relationship. In March, we saw the biggest iteration of the annual war games between the two countries. We call them Balikatan, or shoulder to shoulder, with over 17,000 soldiers from both countries participating, which is twice the number of soldiers in the last year. For the first time, the joint exercise featured the sinking of a decommissioned Navy boat. It's a Navy ship in the South China Sea. It's near the Philippine coast, where they deployed rockets and flew jet fighters as President Marcos watched the spectacle from the side. And the two allies also held joint training between major services, including its armies, where they fired Javelin missiles and HIMARS rocket system, which are the same weapon deployed by the U.S. to Ukraine in its war against Russia. So in May, they also revived an Air Force to Air Force exercise. They deployed several F-16 jet fighters, and they flew with the Philippines FA-50 jets. And to cap up the high-level engagements, Marcos visited Washington last month to meet President Biden, which is the first state visit by a Philippine leader in 10 years. So President Biden, in his remarks, reiterated to Marcos the U.S. ironclad commitment to the Philippines, underscoring that any attack on the Philippine vessels in the South China Sea will trigger the mutual defense treaty between the two countries. And just last week, we saw the coast guards between the Philippines, the United States, and Japan conducting a joint exercise in the waters near the South China Sea. It's a first joint exercise between the two countries, and it's seen as a move to counter Beijing's growing assertiveness in the region. And also there's a joint patrol in the South China Sea that's being planned between the Philippines and the United States, which was halted during the term of President Rodrigo Duterte. So all these events happened in just a year of President Marcos. You know, the policy, the relationship of the US and the Philippines changed in a 360-degree in just a matter of 1 year. And it has garnered the attention of the world media. You know, the Balikatan exercise, for example, after years of covering it, it was the biggest in terms of the number of media that covered. You know, reporters from almost all the news agencies went to the Philippines just to see the joint exercise between the US and the Philippines. It underscores the importance and the significance of these events and how crucial these exercises are as the US and China struggle for power and influence in the region. China, on the other hand, has lost the trust of the Filipinos, of most of the Filipinos, at least according to a survey. And there are several reasons why. First is its reputation. China's reputation is slowly being tarnished by its own actions in the disputed waters. You know, while Chinese leaders have preached about dialogue and non-confrontational means to keep the peace in the region, its Coast Guard ships, however, continue to harass Filipino fishermen and the Philippine Coast Guard ships sailing in the South China Sea. And you know, I have interviewed several fishermen who are fishing in the Scarborough Shoal in the West Philippine Sea, and they told us that they can no longer access their traditional fishing ground where they have been fishing for decades. Like their grandfather were already fishing there, but when Chinese Coast Guard went there, they were prohibited from going inside the show. So that's the first. And the second is the lack of transparency. One thing that makes it increasingly difficult for China to reshape the public opinion, at least in the Philippines, is due to its lack of transparency in its actions. When incidents happen in these waters, for example, the near collision incident or the laser pointing incident, the Chinese embassy in Manila will always take days before they respond to questions or statements from journalists. And what's more difficult is they always refer us to the statements made by the Chinese spokesman in the mainland, you know, leaving almost no room for us to do follow-up questions or to clarify their statements. So this lack of discussion was usually filled with pro-China commentary by think tanks or by academics holding forums on the matter, which also is not the best source of information either. So this kind of interaction or working environment with journalists does not open opportunities for us to clarify their position, and in turn, it doesn't help fight the distrust against China. So what's next for the US-Philippines relationship and the role of the media with this? You know, for one, it's almost guaranteed that the relationship will continue to flourish under President Marcos, unless, of course, China brings something too good to refuse to the table, or at least it changes its behavior in the disputed waters. And that means China has to step up their game in this tug of war, and that also may include propaganda war. And for the media, there's a need for us to keep its watchdog function in the struggle, in this power struggle between China and the US. You know, the media, both local and international news organizations, need to ensure that promises are being kept and the rule of law is being followed. And that's what happened before with the China-Philippines relationship, where the media look at all the pledges that China made to the Philippines, and they realize it's not happening. Like all the billions of dollars that you promised are not coming. And that's when people realize that the promises are not being, kept by Beijing. And we have to do the same thing with Beijing, with Washington, when they made promises about defense support to the Philippine military modernization or to their support in other problems in the country. And more importantly, we need to go out in the field to see what's being said is what's actually happening on the ground, even if that requires, flying over the skies or crossing the high seas. And with the information warfare between the two superpowers, and it's expected to escalate, we have to make sure that we don't fall into the trap and that we remain independent. Because we journalists are only accountable to the public, and we must always take side with the truth. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron, for your sharing. So starting from the experience of the water disputes, then you also talk about what the Philippine people's perception about China. Yeah, because of this, this kind of dispute. And for Taiwanese people, we are very familiar with this scenario because, for about a year, Chinese, just always expose their forces on Taiwan, and they have the, even the battleship around the Taiwan Strait, just as what happened in you called West Philippine Sea. But from China's perspective, that's the South China Sea. So it seems to me, the Chinese strategist is trying to expand their territory, expand their sea from the public open sea into domestic sea. So yeah, I think that scenario is very familiar to us. And you also mentioned that under this situation, what's the role of the press and the media? And you mentioned about the rule of law, and also, of course, the final protection is very important. As a reporter, to tell the truth is the most important thing to your readers and the audience. And I will have a following question, but that might be later. I'm very interested in knowing, as a Philippine reporter, but working for foreign media, what's the pros and cons when you cover news stories? And does that provide you more, rooms or advantages when covering a news story, or it will bring more limitations? You can think about it, yeah, because I'm very interested in, to know more about your experience. But before that, we're very happy to listen to what Jiang Huaizhe will tell us. Yeah, and I have to confess that Philippines is very close to Taiwan, right? Yeah, but from my experience, I have never been, to Philippines, and I have very, very little knowledge about the neighbor country. So Jiang Huaizhe will provide a small knowledge about the Philippines' modern history and the Philippines' relationship with China and the United States, which will provide us a very good background to know more about, being a reporter to covering news stories in Philippines. Okay, so yeah, let's welcome Jiang Huaizhe.
So first of all, I would like to thank our host organization today for kindly inviting me to this panel, especially sharing the floor with Ron, who just delivered a very excellent presentation. Me being a non-journalist here, I think what I would like to do today is not actually responding to what Ron just presented, but maybe a supplement or echoing some of the points Ron had already made. As mentioned by Professor Hong, I'm the Associate Research Fellow at the Foundation for Future Generations here in Taiwan, Qingpingtai. And I was the author of The Origins of Modern Philippine Politics, 现代菲律宾政治的起源. I got to know Philippines luckily throughout my college years, during which I did internships, and also subsequently I had the opportunity to go back and forth the Philippines and do some short reporting trips, but not strictly writing reports, but mostly still commentaries on Philippine politics for Hong Kong media groups and also Chinese media groups. And so without further ado, let me begin my presentation. I also sort of stole Ron's presentation title. His presentation title was also the Enduring U.S.-Philippine Alliance. His was a journalist's note. Mine is from a Taiwanese perspective. So as Ron has described, because of tensions in the South China Sea, Philippine-China relations have been very fraught throughout the years, especially in our recent memories throughout the past decade. Throughout the former President Duterte's term, of course, there was some rapprochement trying to be an attempt on the Philippine side, but I think from the outside we can observe it was not entirely successful. With the advent of the new Marcos administration, we do see a strengthening of U.S.-Philippine security relations, and especially concerning collaboration in the South China Sea. But what I would like to add a little bit to Ron's presentation is that I think thinking around a potential Taiwan Strait contingency scenario has also been very front and center, has also been a very key issue into our thinking about why U.S.-Philippine relations have been strengthening, especially in the last year, especially as Ron has already told us earlier, the new EDCA sites that have been added, a number of them are bordering the Bashi Channel, the channel which just divides Taiwan and the Philippines. But this entanglement between Taiwan and U.S. relations with Philippine-U.S. relations is not something entirely new. It has its roots back even into the Cold War. Let me do a little bit of history here. In contrast with the United States' transatlantic relationship with its European partners, which was mostly characterized in the form of NATO, a collective security agreement, America's relations with its Asian allies was mostly in the form what scholars characterize as a hubs and spoke system, which means U.S. as at center and formulated throughout a series of bilateral security agreements with its key Asian partners. All of them, most of them were formulated in the early years of the Cold War. For example, treaty with South Korea, Japan, Thailand, Philippines, and Australia, but also with other secondary agreements, for example, logistical agreements with partners such as Singapore. These bilateral relations altogether formulate a dense web of U.S. security commitments in the region, which has provided, at least from the U.S. perspective, stability and peace for the region for the past few decades. Similarly to U.S. and Europe is that we also see a large number of U.S. troops forward deployed to the region, especially in the Asian context, large numbers in South Korea and also Japan. This brings me to my topic today, is that what we can clearly see is a historical continuity from the old Cold War to what many call a new Cold War, what we're in today. With that in mind, what I would like to talk about today is Philippine, U.S., Taiwan security relations during these three periods. I do think that a historical perspective is very important for us. It would provide us insights and maybe possible hints into how this trilateral interaction could move forward in the coming years. So now, without further ado, the first phase during the Cold War. So in the late days of the Chinese Civil War, after Chiang Kai-shek left mainland China, he didn't immediately come to Taiwan. Actually, during July of 1949, he visited the Philippines first and met with President Quirino at the time. And the joint statement that we can see is that President Chiang Kai-shek was trying to at least propose to President Quirino that both countries, as far eastern countries, they should collaborate together and possibly formulate a union to counter a common communist menace. Communist menace not necessarily only meaning the Chinese Communist Party, which was already raging through mainland China at the time, but also Russian communism just in the top of the Asian continent. Well, we can see the thinking behind this visit at the time. We can also draw from some CIA reports at the time is that three possible reasons offered by CIA. One is that with this new Philippine recently just independent from the US, maybe President Quirino was trying to cower himself more support and financial backing from loyal nationalist Chinese. I'll talk about a little bit more about this later. Maybe also trying to impress the United States with the Philippines' potential in handling regional affairs. The third reason could also be because the Philippines at the time, if we understand correctly, many of you already know, General MacArthur had just recently reconquered the Philippines from the wrath of the Japanese Imperial Army. Manila and many Philippine cities were totally devastated, and reconstruction took money. They wanted to attract more economic aid from their American allies. These efforts were not put forward by the Americans. Some of them maybe not necessarily encouraged by the Americans, but they were put forward by like-minded Asian leaders which had a common ideological imagination of Asia, which was anti-communist. This anti-communist Asian imagination culminated in 1954 into the form of an Asian People's Anti-Communist League, not only with participants from Taiwan and the Philippines, but also from South Korea. This organization at the time was formed in parallel with SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which you can see as an Asian version of NATO, which was unluckily a failure in the coming years. But we should also not mistake that this anti-communist fervor, this anti-communist common imagination was only something discussed by high government officials. This was also something that was working down below the government level, especially on an organization level and also on individuals. Here I'm drawing from Professor Gong Jianwen's research, professor at National University of Singapore, and his book just published last year, Diasporic Cold Warriors, Nationalist China, Anti-Communism, and the Philippine Chinese, 1930s to 1970s. He provides a very comprehensive picture of how the Philippine approach towards its Chinese citizens within its land was different with its other Southeast Asian neighbors. Namely, in the sense that while other Southeast Asian countries were very busy trying to assimilate their Chinese population, the Philippine government at the time was pretty much reluctant. They were pretty exclusionary towards these Chinese nationals which have resided in their land for many decades. What was the result of this kind of policy was, as Professor Gong Jianwen had coined, is a shared sovereignty between the Republic of China, Taiwan government and Taiwan, with the Philippine government, a shared sovereignty towards these Chinese citizens which were residing in Manila at the time. As we can see at the time, the Philippine Chinese community was largely controlled and influenced by pro-KMT organizations, a large number of them which are still in operation today. For example, the Chiang Kai-shek High School, Jiangjieshi学院in Manila. This also resulted in a number of expulsion of Chinese nationals which had resided in the Philippines for a long time under the name of anti-communism. For example, the Shangbao Sijian in 1970, the Chinese commercial news affair in 1970s, where two Philippine Chinese newspaper owners were accused by the local Chinese community and also KMT groups as being a newspaper with communist sympathies. They were apprehended by the Philippine government and then subsequently sent towards Taiwan. Taiwan at the time was under its white terror period. These two Chinese men who had resided in the Philippines for most of their life were sent into jail under the name of anti-communism. However, this influence the KMT, the ROC, had over the Philippine Chinese community was not to last forever. It was also greatly diminished after 1971. For example, Chinese schools, which at the time were still able to teach Chinese, were Philippinized in 1973. In 1975, the naturalization process for Chinese nationals in the Philippines, which in previous year was so difficult, so arduous, was largely simplified, which allowed for large numbers of Chinese nationals presiding in the Philippines to naturalize. And also, most importantly, Manila shifted diplomatic recognition to Beijing. However, we should not mistake the cessation of diplomatic ties between Taiwan and the Philippines as the end of this anti-communist partnership. What we can see from also other historical documents, for example, the Wang Shen Papers, which is now housed in the Hoover Institution in Stanford University today, is that we do see hints that this anti-communist partnership was still here to last, however, in a more clandestine form. For example, Wang Shen, which many people familiar with military history and ROC's history in Taiwan would know, he was a very close confidant to President Jiang Jingguo. He's a very important intelligence high-level official. During the late 1970s and also the early 1980s, he visited a number of non-communist Southeast Asian countries. This is not something of a surprise because he himself, of course, was the leader of the ROC military corps in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So, for example, when he visited the Philippines in 1979, President Marcos told Wang Shen that, from historical records, that President Marcos said that he was staunchly anti-communist. And also when Wang Shen discussed with Marcos's military staff, they also requested that Taipei export more munitions, light weapons, provide joint military training, and even collaborate together in intelligence sharing. Interestingly, the military staff that Wang Shen met at the time in the Philippines were later to be important historical figures. For example, he met with Juan Ponce and Ministry of National Defense at the time, and also Fidel Ramos, who was son of Narcisco Ramos, who was a very pro-ROC in Taiwan, Philippine diplomat who was former ambassador of the Philippines to ROC in Taiwan. At the time, Juan Ponce, he was a Ministry of National Defense, and also Fidel Ramos, he was chief of the Philippine Constabulary, which was a sort of a joint service between the military and the Philippine police service. Later on, these two persons will play a very important role in Philippines democratization in February of 1986. Their failed military coup sort of encouraged a large number of Philippine protesters to go onto the streets of Manila, especially EDSA Avenue in Manila, which created pressure for Marcos and subsequently Marcos's departure from his office in February that year. This interesting individual relationship between these two individuals with Taiwan would also be very important in the post-Cold War era. So in the post-Cold era, with the demise of rigid ideological camps, what we saw was China's opening up to the global economy, drawing a lot of foreign investments, drawing a lot of foreign businesses eager to access China's large market. This was nothing different for Taiwan, nothing different for the Philippines or most of the other countries in the world. That created a dilemma for Taiwan. So President Lee Teng-hui of Taiwan at the time, he pronounced a Go South policy in 1994, which was in the aim to diversify Taiwan's economic relationship, diversify Taiwan's economic partnership so that it would not depend on China too much. It would not have too much of its business just leave Taiwan and move into China. So what we see, a photo on the top left is President Lee Teng-hui with no one else than President Fidel Ramos at the time. Why did this happen? Because at the time, the ROC government in Taiwan, led by President Lee Teng-hui, was embarking on a new diplomatic offensive in the name of 度假外交, vacation diplomacy. In the name of vacation, he visited a number of countries for example, Thailand, Indonesia, and also the Philippines. This, as I mentioned, a continuation of a relationship that was born fruit and during the Cold War. However, as we know today, that effort to diversify Thailand's economic relationship with its neighboring countries largely failed. Of course, FDI towards Southeast Asians did have a bump in the early years of the Go South policy, but was increasingly surpassed by investments towards China, especially as most other countries in the world were moving into that direction. However, as China's economy transformed and also global environments changed, with the rising production costs in China and also an increasingly unfavorable business environment, what we see is businesses, foreign businesses, increasingly moving out of China and also investing into Southeast Asia, which is also a very prominent, booming economy in the eyes of investors and businessmen worldwide. For example, with Taiwan's inauguration of the New Southbound policy by President Tsai Ing-wen in 2016, that was also a move into that direction, and also accelerated by other external events, for example, the US-China trade war, the COVID experience, and also other geopolitical trends. Other, I think, additional important things that I think I should address for the post-Cold War period is that during this period, which I believe has not fully ended, is that public imagination of Thai and Philippine relations has been largely characterized by two things. One thing is maritime disputes and South China Sea issues. For example, in 2013, when the Guangdaxing incident, which involved a Taiwanese fishing boat and the Philippine Coast Guard, which tragically resulted in one Chinese fisherman being gunned down by the Philippine Coast Guard. Taiwanese news coverage of it was, I think, very interesting in that regard, because we saw some individual media groups going with a very jingoistic tone. Their newspaper titles at the time, they were directly comparing Taiwan's military with the Philippines military and showing that Taiwanese had superior military power, so that, well, if it had the opportunity to go to war with the Philippines, it would be able to crush the Philippines very easy on. Of course, that's not all what all media groups had reported on that time, but some did so. I think that pretty much showed what's, I would not say most, but at least a sizable proportion of Taiwanese people, they thought of Philippines as mostly a developing country and were having a more condescending attitude towards it. And also other issues, for example, when the Philippines filed arbitration for their South China Sea claims, we could also see the RC government, the Taiwan government at the time, its claims were largely at odds with not only the Philippines, but basically all of its Southeast Asian neighbors. Another issue was that is migrant worker issues. As we all know, with Taiwan's declining birth rate and also its continuing booming economy, the issue of labor shortage has already been here for many years. We see an increasing large number of migrant workers in Taiwan, a sizable proportion of them coming from the Philippines. Thus, issues of abuse, either domestically or with factories. Also, when during COVID lockdown, how their labor conditions were, these were also interests of not only domestic media, but also international news coverage. And now we move into the new Cold War period. Adding on and echoing to what Ron had just earlier presented, we do see a strengthening of Philippine-U.S. security ties. I think the strengthening of this security relationship, we need to also put it into a historical perspective. The U.S.-Philippine security relationship is now supported by three main pillars laid out on my slide here. The 1951 MDT, the 1999 VFA, and the 2014 EDCA. These three pillars do different things. The 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty is the most important of all. It provides a joint defense guarantee between reciprocity between the Philippines and the U.S., simply meaning saying that when the Philippines is attacked, the U.S. will come to the Philippines' aid. However, this was something of dispute for many years, because within the exact article, within Article 4, it said in territories, in areas surrounding its Pacific region, Pacific Sea, exact wording I forgot. And there was for many years doubt whether Philippines' claims in the South China Sea were covered by Article 4 or not. The VFA mostly governs American troops' legal status in the Philippines, and also mutually when the Philippines troops visit the US, their legal status. This VFA was very important, especially after the termination of the military bases agreement in 1991. And also later in 2014, ECA was signed. It also provided additional legal and also administrative status for US troops rotating in the Philippines, and also US usage of Philippine military facilities. All three pillars of this security relationship has been strengthened in the past few years. For example, the MDT. In 2019, in March, at the time, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stated that the South China Sea was within the coverage of the MDT, period. This was a very important statement on part of the US because during the Obama administration, they were unwilling to give such statements. And also later on in 2021, November, both governments at the time, the Biden administration and then still the Duterte administration, issued forward a joint vision for a 21st century US-Philippine partnership, which touched upon aspects not only related to security relations, but also social, politics, technology, etc. The Visiting Forces Agreement was interesting because it was also covered extensively by media in 2020 because at the time, President Duterte threatened to terminate it, however, only to sort of terminate his termination later on in 2021. And also ECA, as Ron and myself have already talked about earlier, we have 4 new sites just announced in April, all 3 pillars enhanced. So I would also like to reiterate again that this enhancement, we should view it not only within the purview of Philippine-US relationship also only within the South China Sea scenario, but also within a wider US-China geopolitical competition, and also thinking around a potential time contingency. I would like to share here just several quotes from the Philippine government in the past year around issues related to Taiwan. For example, last year when Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, the Philippines Foreign Ministry said that it was concerned with rising tensions in the Taiwan Strait just north of the Philippines, and it urged both parties to restrain, and also diplomacy and dialogue should prevail. In comparison with other Southeast Asian countries' statements, and also with ASEAN's statements itself, this was a relatively strong statement. And of course, analysts around the world took note. The DND, the Ministry of Defense at the time, also, when asked, they also said they had contingency measures in place in case tension escalated in an armed confrontation. Contingency measures meaning that they had a detailed plan to bring, what I earlier mentioned, these large number of Filipinos which were residing, either living or studying or working in Taiwan, back to the Philippines during armed conflict. And also later, a month later, when the Philippine ambassador to US, Ambassador Ramirez, was asked, would Philippines give access to access to its military bases to the US if a Taiwan Strait conflict broke out? He answered that if it was important for us, if it was important for the Philippines' own security. President Marcos's speech later that month at the UN General Assembly was also largely along these lines. Another example was in one of Marcos's many foreign trips since he assumed office just a few months ago, less than a year. He also, when he was in Tokyo, he was asked this question about the Taiwan Strait, and he also said that it was very hard to imagine that the Philippines would not get involved in a Taiwan Strait contingency. Very hard to imagine a scenario where the Philippines would not somehow get involved precisely because of Taiwan and the Philippines' geographical proximity. And also, interestingly, when new ECA sites were announced in April, just a few months ago, President Marcos said that he will not let any of these bases, any of the Philippines bases, to be used for whatever offensive action. All in all, I think what we can see is obviously there's a strengthening of US-Philippine security relationships. But at the same time, we can also see that the Philippines is walking a tightrope here. It does not want to be seen as leading the charge against China. It wants to balance its relationship between the US and the Philippines. So besides, Marcos's trip to the Philippines, and also, for example, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, also Secretary Blinken's visit to the Philippines, what we should also see is the other side of the story, which is when President Marcos visited China earlier this year, he also had very positive things to say. He does not want to be entangled within a U.S.-China rivalry. He does not want to be involved in the Taiwan Strait contingency. But of course, he knows that his intentions, the Philippines' positions within this larger environment has its limitations, as is the same with Taiwan. So from the Cold War, when both countries' relationships were envisioned more in a common anti-communist frame, to during the post-Cold War, when everybody was thinking about how to improve their economy, FDI, trade paramount during those days, to now us moving into what a lot of analysts characterize as a new Cold War. Will this lead to changing perceptions of the Philippines and Philippine-Taiwan relationships in Taiwan? For example, will we increasingly see the Philippines not just as a partner in when we need a labor shortage or other things, or a common ideological partner, a common security partner along these issues? Or will we still continue to think about the Philippines along the lines that we've been thinking in the past 30 years? Or will something of a new imagination bear fruit and come out of place? I think these are all very important questions. And I also think these are also very important issues that we should continue to observe in the coming years. Thank you.
Well, quite learning. Thanks, John Pfizer, for the insightful presentation about the history and the geopolitics of Philippines, of the relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines, and also where is Taiwan, or what's the role of Taiwan between the Philippines and the U.S. alliance. And actually, I have a lot of questions to our presenters, and let's check the time. And currently, we have about a half an hour for the QA section. And I already proposed a question to Ron, right? And let me try to propose some questions for the presenters to answer, and then we will have more time for our audience. So my first question to Ron, as I just mentioned, what's the pros and cons as a reporter in Philippines working for foreign agency, and especially we know about the political, and situation in Philippines. And last year, Maria Ressa, right, the recipient of Nobel Peace Award, and also a very active news media worker. Yeah, she's now still in jail, right? Okay, so yeah, of course we get concerned about the freedom of the press. So my question is that working in Philippines, do you feel the limitation? And when we talk about the China factor or China issue, because of the international relationship, and it seems that to the U.S. to fight against China is just stand with the position of the Philippine government. But how about as news reporters, how to supervise the government if you want to cover stories which is against the interests of the government, and how big of the room you will ensure in Philippines context. And I have another question. So under this situation, we know that China has invested a lot of resources for 大外宣 to try to formulate the international perception about China. So, so do you think, and the efforts of 大外宣, the Chinese government, put in Philippines have some influence on Philippines people's perception? So this is my second question. And I have, sorry, so many questions. Yeah, I have questions to Jiang Huaizhe. And you talk about especially the post-Cold War situation. And in recent years, Taiwanese government has, of course, we have some new policy, especially from Go South to new southbound policy in Tsai Ing-wen's government. But what's the influence of this policy? And does that help, to enhance the relationship, especially from the civil society perspective, the relationship between Philippines and Taiwan? And of course, I know you study in international politics, but could you also help to provide your observation about Taiwan's media coverage of Philippines? Does that help Taiwanese people to understand Philippines, our neighbor country? So that's my questions to both of you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Hung. Just a clarification though, because I just resigned from AFP last week, so I'm no longer with the AFP. I just resigned, so I'm a freelance journalist in the Philippines right now. So the first question is on the like the pros and cons basically of working for an international organization in the Philippines. Well, the pros is if you are working for a big organization in the Philippines, you have resources, and that means your company can fund missions going to these places that small newsrooms cannot provide. And it's especially important for stories like the South China Sea, for example, because these are not cheap missions. Like if you wanted to go to the northern Philippines just to visit some fishermen there and talk to them, it will require going there for at least like 3 days, and you have to pay for the fishing boats and all those resources that needed. So that's one of the major thing that will help you in doing the coverage if you're working for an international news organization. And the second is because AFP has office in different countries. We have bureaus, we have the headquarters in Hong Kong, we have bureau in Taiwan, we have bureau in Thailand, in the Mekong region. We can cross-collaborate on the stories that are Asia Pacific in nature. So if you wanted to get a picture of what's happening in the South China Sea, we won't be limited by our interviews with the fishermen in the Philippines. We can ask our colleagues in Brunei, we can ask our colleagues here in Taiwan who also have like interlapping claims in the South China Sea. So you could get a full picture of the story and just not rely on one side of the globe. Although the cons, of course, it comes with like cons of being a foreign correspondent. First and foremost, I think the biggest problem with me is when I talk to officials and I talk to like policemen or military officers, and I introduce myself. Agence France Presse is not a very famous news organization. So and then I'm working for a wire agency, so I have to explain what it is. Like I have to explain who is the audience when they ask me, what channel are can we watch this news? And I can even tell them one, because we don't have a dedicated news channel. I'll just tell them that our work can be viewed can be picked up by BBC or CNN or Al Jazeera. So that's one of the main cons. And the second is, I think one of the frustrations of a foreign correspondent, if you're working as a foreign correspondent, is you have to consider your international audience. So not stories in your country will be a story for the world. And that could be very frustrating. Like there are stores in the Philippines that are big stores in the local, but the world doesn't care. we always look for like the grandest. Is it the biggest exercise? Is it the most colorful protest? Is it the hyperlatives? It should be the superlatives of the events. It cannot be just, you know, one shooting incident and killed one people. That's not a story in the Philippines. Like if there's one people that died in a train in Washington after he was stabbed, that's a story in the US. But five people in the Philippines get stabbed, that's not even a story for an international audience. So you have to balance how to get the attention of the world. Like, why would people care for this story? And sometimes it's very difficult. Like, why would someone in the western part of the world care about the story in a small country that they don't even know where it is? Like, if you go to Europe and ask them, do you know where the Philippines is? They'll probably know. They probably say, is it where the boxer Manny Pacquiao lived? Or is it part of China? Is it a province in China? Because they don't even know. So the challenge is, how do you make them care about the stories? How do you make them listen to the statements by the people? So it's kind of the main con of working for international audience, but you have to look at it as a challenge. Like, as a journalist, how can you sell the story? And what we usually do is, you know, we look for human interest story. If it's not because this is one thing that I think happens in the Philippines, and it's the same thing with Taiwan. You know, if a foreigner hears the word Taiwan, the first question is, are you going to be invaded? They don't care about your inflation. They don't care if the education is not very good. The question that will always pop in their mind, the biggest thing, that's the most important thing for us, the most important thing for them is Taiwan is associated with a possible conflict with China. And it's the same thing that happens in the Philippines. Like when this problem, when the South China Sea dispute happens, people don't really care about what's the price of the market in the Philippines. Like, how many people are going hungry in the Philippines? No, they care if, is the Philippines siding with the US or China? Are you allowing your military bases to be used by the Americans? So these are the pros and cons of working for international audience. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Then, how about Jiang Huaizhe? Give us some perspective. Okay, thank you.
Actually, I had some thoughts to start using Chinese to become lazy, but I decided that since I've already gone through my presentation in English, I'll just continue using English. Actually, when I was doing my presentation, I was worrying that I'd speak too fast because I listened to podcasts with 1.8 speed, worryingly about that. So thank you, Professor Hong, for the very important questions, I believe. First question was about the influence of the new southbound policy, especially concerning civil society interactions. My first job after college was actually working on the new southbound policy in the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation, which was actually also part of the more civil society engagement arm of the policy. I would argue that there have always been, this is my personal opinion, there have always been two aspects of the new southbound policy. One is that the new southbound policy is no doubtly human-centered. It sets us apart with other regional strategies deployed by other countries, not only because this is what Taiwan believes, but also this is a necessity for Taiwan. In the absence of official diplomatic relations, we would also always have to have our private enterprises, our civil society organizations, our individuals traversing our borders to shoulder much of this burden. But at the same time also, I believe that the new southbound policy, at least on the government spending level, is also multifaceted. It involves a international strategy dimension. It also involves a government-to-government relations dimension, and also lastly, what Professor Hong mentioned, the civil society interaction dimension. I would argue that actually the civil society interaction dimension has been the one that has been most successful. Reasons being because a lot of people try to judge the New Southbound policy's success by, for example, numbers in terms of trade volumes. This is, a common inertia of governments, trying to evaluate a policy by using number of students coming to Taiwan, number of tourists coming bilaterally. But actually, I also think we should look at the more qualitative dimension. For example, nowadays, Chinese news coverage of Southeast Asia and Taiwan has changed a lot since 2016. Of course, economic coverage dominates, but at the same time, we also see that Chinese media are more cognizant nowadays of the social dimension, migrant workers in Taiwan, for example, Philippine cultural taste, local delicacies, local social, political, environmental issues. Because of this uptick of interest in Southeast Asian countries, has these other dimensions of Southeast Asian countries being able to be broadcasted, be able to have an audience in Taiwan. I think on that part, we have to take the policy. And of course, even if we delve into the more quantitative dimensions of the New Southbound policy, human people-to-people interactions between Taiwan and the Philippines and other Southeast Asian countries has increased a lot, especially with tourism. Sadly, because of COVID, this upward trend has gone down quite a bit, but I believe that we would see it rebound quite quickly in the coming months and coming years. And also, I believe student interaction has also been a very key aspect of Taiwan's increased engagement of Southeast Asia. This is, of course, partly because of 2016 with the change of government, decreasing number of Chinese students coming to Taiwan. And at the time, Taiwan is putting forward its New Southbound policy. So encouraging students from Southeast Asia to study, to exchange in Taiwan. Of course, there were some other social issues and other human rights concerns relating to them working outside of the classroom. I think a lot of people in this room are very familiar with, but overall has been generally positive for bilateral relations. And another aspect I would also like to think is very important is that mother tongue language education in Taiwan. Because prior to the New Southbound policy, Taiwan, you can learn your mother tongue in elementary school. So that might be, for example, Vietnamese/Taiwanese, Hakka, or other indigenous languages. In the past few years, children of Southeast Asian spouses, Southeast Asian migrants in Taiwan, they're now able to access language courses in Thai, Filipino Tagalog, Bahasa Indonesia, and other languages in Taiwanese schools nowadays because of the policy. So I think, of course, these things are more on the qualitative direction, but in the long run, actually, I think these foundations are the most important if Taiwan decides to further enhance its relations with the region. The second question is about Chinese media's news coverage of the Philippines. Actually, this is one of the reasons why I decided to write my book last year, because if you look at Chinese media's news coverage of the Philippines, I gave some examples earlier. Some topics dominate, right? Migrant worker issues, and economic relationships, and also when the Philippines has an election, news coverage. Sadly, the Philippines also only has presidential elections every 6 years. So most Chinese people only notice the Philippines every 6 years. But of course, I think, and also in recent years, geopolitics, right? This creates questions and issues on its own. For example, if you don't only cover Philippine politics every 6 years, there will be very few foundations for individual journalists, even organizations, or even scholars to research about Philippine politics in Taiwan. So the question with Chinese coverage about the Philippines is that when they try to engage local scholars and ask them about the Philippines, they find very few. They find very few local experts that are more experienced on Philippine affairs. And what we get is a more exaggerated imagination of issues in the Philippines. For example, when Duterte's administration put forward the drug war, you look at Chinese media, it's about people getting gunned down in the streets every day. Right? Obviously, of course, that's very important, but they focus on the blood. rather than the exact stories and the more social complexities between why some individuals support these things while others are dead against. And I think those things are very important. And also even on migrant worker issues. Chinese media coverage focuses on the Philippines, obviously from its own perspective, right? So our interaction with Philippine migrant workers has been, a lot of it has been shaped by our own individual experiences. For example, some people have had domestic help, which are from the Philippines. Some have encountered Philippine laborers working in Chinese factories and elsewhere. So they have a more, they sympathize with the Philippines. When they think about the Philippines, they think about sorrow. They think about people forced to migrate abroad to work. I don't think this is a bad thing, but I think it is also dangerous sometimes to merely imagine Taiwan's relationship with the Philippines alongside these issues, because obviously the Philippines has an increasingly large middle class, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different regional backgrounds have different interests, different imaginations of their countries. That complexity is sort of absent in our imagination of the Philippines today. So to end this, I think Taiwan really needs to invest more into basic research on the Philippines, on Philippine politics and the Philippine society. So that I think that will provide a better foundation for news coverage of the Philippines moving down in the future. Thank you.
We still have 15 minutes, so the opportunity is all yours. So anyone want to? Yes, great, thank you.
Hello, Philip Nubel, Global Voices. Thank you very much for the panel, very interesting. I'm learning a lot. I have a question, I guess, mostly for Mr. Lopez. I was wondering if the Philippines, as itself a former colony and a country that suffered a lot from colonialism, whether specifically in the Filipino language or in the Philippine English language media, when covering China, do you see journalists, editors using the terms of neo-colonialism, colonialism, or imperialism when covering China?
Well, at least based on my observation, the media doesn't use those terms very often. It's usually the leftist groups, the left-wing organizations who are using the neoliberal, because their view is that the Philippines should not take sides with this tug of war between China and the Philippines. So whether we join China or we support the United States, it's still imperialism based on the lens of the leftist organization. But from the media, at least I know, they don't really use that much of neoliberalism or colonialism. Yeah, and I don't think a lot of the people in the Philippines understand what that means. So when you try to tell stories to the audience, you don't use words that, you try to simplify, and that's probably one of the reasons why neoliberal colonialisms are the words that we try to avoid in the reporting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any more questions? No? Zhengping.
Sorry, I have little knowledge about the Philippines, so forgive me if my question too primitive. How is the legacy of Duterte today in the Marcos administration? That Duterte's daughter is now vice president, right? And how is his legacy still play a role in the discussion regarding to the issues we are discussing now? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't really want to be too much political, but when we talk about the legacy of the former President Duterte, I mean, there's really not much. I mean, you have the drug war that raged for over 6 years, with thousands of people killed, like 6,000 people were killed during the drug war. And if you look at it as a legacy, yeah, probably not. And the drug trade still continues in the Philippines. And when it comes to the disputes with the South China Sea, like the reason why he didn't bring up the Hague ruling on the South China Sea is because he didn't want to antagonize Beijing and to keep the peace in the South China Sea. But even after that, you know, we still see some skirmishes, some problems happening on those fronts. So it didn't really end the aggressive actions of China, despite being friendly with them for over 6 years. So yeah, but one of the legacy of President Duterte is probably his daughter. His daughter is now the vice president, and will probably be the next president in the Philippines. So, I mean, in the Philippines, it's very easy to know who will be the next president based on what's happening right now. Like even just after the election, we know she could be the next, you know, thing to cover. So, yeah, it's probably another Duterte in the next few years, sadly. So, thank you.
Okay. So, okay. Yeah, we got another question from Jia Yi.
Yeah, I'm Chu, and CEO of the FIJA, and follow the chairman's question. I am wondering about the junior Marcos, the president, and does he treat journalists better than Duterte? Does he treat you better? I mean, because the Duterte is quite mean to many journalists. Because last year we have Maria Ressa as our speaker, and she is became an enemy of Duterte after the because she and her staff and her colleagues make some reporting about the drug wars, and quite critical about the drug war because against the human rights, etc. And so the Maria Ressa become the enemy of the former president. And how is the new president's attitude about rebels, those journalists critical to Philippine government? Is anything changed or still the same?
Yeah, the press freedom in the Philippines under President Marcos, yeah, it's a bit difficult to judge by now because it's been only a year since his term, because President Duterte in his first few years, he was very open to media. Like he can hold a press conference for 3 hours and us journalists monitoring it have to monitor it until midnight. Like that's how open he is. But during the latter years of Duterte, as we see, you know, we have several journalists being face cases of libel, of trumped-up charges because of the way they report against the drug war. So I cannot say that Marcos will be better because it's too early, but at least on how we are doing right now, I mean, we're open to cover. We can report basically what we can, but you know, in any situation, we try to be cautious with our reportage, and I think that says a lot about the condition of the press freedom. But you know, there are still so many journalists, not in the Philippines, not only in the Philippines, but in Asia, who are facing charges. You know, Maria Ressa is still facing libel charges, and Marcos didn't really drop the charges against her. So that also speaks of how he looked at it. And there were community journalists in the province, in the Philippines, who were also facing charges related to anti-terrorism. You know, especially the leftist journalists. If you're a journalist and you have a progressive view, that could be considered, if you're a communist in the Philippines, you're basically terrorists. So if you're a journalist with a progressive view, that could put you in trouble in the Philippines. And that doesn't change under President Marcos. So it's not a clear night and day difference between the two presidents. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, do we have more questions? Okay.
I'm a graduate student from GW Elliott School, and I used to work in Legislative Yuan in Taiwan. I have one question. It's in American media, I saw a danger, like any actions strengthen ties with U.S. will be interpreted as against China. So especially in a Philippines case. So how can we not overreact or underreact Philippines act with U.S.? Thank you.
Just wanted to be clear with the question. So it's like,
how can we view President Macron's strengthened ties with U.S. with a more nuanced view?
sorry, can you say that again?
Okay, sorry for that. Because in U.S. media,
Yeah.
they are overemphasize President Macron's tie, like his act with strengthening ties with U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we view that with a more prudent view about President Macron's actions these days with
Mm-hmm.
U.S.?
Well, if you ask the government, the Philippine government, like their foreign policy is like friend to all, enemy to none, and that could be a very, very difficult to do in this certain age. I mean, if I would understand from the first few years of Marcos to say that policy, but definitely, I mean, it's obvious now that President Marcos has sided with the U.S. in this kind of in this tug of war between the two countries, and I don't think we can say that we are overreacting when we say that the Philippines is siding with the U.S. because it's very difficult for the Philippines to side with China right now with all the things that's happening. Like, it's very obvious that they have to switch side and go form an alliance with the U.S. Yeah, I don't think they're friends anymore. I mean, Chinese Xi Jinping met with President Marcos and they have a very good relationship. But after that, we have, harassment that's happening in the South China Sea. So what you see on the television with the Philippines and China relationship is part of the diplomatic balancing between the two countries, and that's fairly that's the right thing to do for presidents. But if you look at what's happening, if you look at the developments, if you look at the deals that's being developed, if you look at the what's happening on the ground, the Philippines is definitely with the U.S. Thank you.